Nammo Phat. Good morning. Thank you for joining me for our daily practice check-in. Listen, listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls us back to our true home. The third wonderful precept. Aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I vow to cultivate responsibility and learn ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. I am determined not to engage in sexual relations without love and a long-term commitment. To preserve the happiness of myself and others, I am determined to respect my commitments and the commitments of others. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. We're continuing our new book that we're reading together, Ajahn Thanissara's The Karma of Questions. This is from the first chapter as well. A fair number of writers have pointed out that the basic confidence inherent in the Four Noble Truths, and yet the rumor of Buddhism's pessimism persists. I wonder why. One possible explanation is that in coming to Buddhism, we subconsciously expect it to address issues that have a long history in our own culture. By starting out with suffering as his first truth, the Buddha seems to be offering his position on a question with a long history in the West. Is the world basically good or bad? According to Genesis, this was the first question that occurred to God after he finished his creation. Had he done a good job? He then looked at the world and saw that it was good. Ever since then, people in the West have sided with or against God on his answer. But in doing so, they have affirmed that the question was worth asking to begin with. When Theravada, the only form of Buddhism to take on Christianity when Europe colonized Asia, was looking for ways to head off what it saw as the missionary menace, Buddhists who had received their education from the missionaries assumed that the question was valid and pressed the First Noble Truth into service as a refutation of the Christian God. Look at how miserable life is, they said, and it's hard to accept God's verdict on his handiwork. This debating strategy may have scored a few points at the time, and it's easy to find Buddhist apologists who, still living in the colonial past, keep trying to score the same points. The real issue, though, is whether the Buddha intended his First Noble Truth to answer God's question in the first place, and more importantly, whether we're getting the most out of the First Noble Truth if we see it in that light. It's hard to imagine what you could accomplish by saying that life is suffering. You'd have to spend your time arguing with people who see more than just suffering in life. The Buddha himself says as much in one of his discourses. A Brahmin named Longnails, Diganaka, comes to him and announces that he doesn't approve of anything. This would have been a perfect time for the Buddha, if he had wanted, to chime in with the truth that life is suffering. Instead, he attacks the whole notion of taking a stand on whether life is worthy of approval. The three possible answers to the question, he says. 1. Nothing is worthy of approval. 2. Everything is. And 3. Some things are, and some things aren't. If you take any of these three positions, you end up arguing with the people who take either of the other two positions. And where does that get you? The Buddha then teaches Longnails to look at his body and feelings as instances of the First Noble Truth. They're stressful and constant, and don't deserve to be clung to as self. Long-Nails follows the Buddha's instructions, and in letting go of his attachment to body and feelings, gains his first glimpse of the deathless, of what it's like to be totally free from suffering. The point of the story is that trying to answer God's question, passing judgment on the world, is a waste of time, and it offers a better use for the First Noble Truth, looking at things not in terms of world or life, but simply identifying suffering so that you can comprehend it, let it go, and attain release. Rather than asking us to make a blanket judgment, which in effect would be asking us to be blind partisans, the First Noble Truth asks us to look and see precisely where the problem of suffering lies. Other discourses show that the problem isn't with body and feelings in and of themselves. They themselves aren't suffering. The suffering lies in clinging to them. In his definition of the First Noble Truth, the Buddha summarizes all types of suffering under the phrase, the 5 aggregates of clinging. Clinging to physical form, including the body, feelings, perceptions, thought constructs, and consciousness. However, when the 5 aggregates are free from clinging, he tells us, they lead to long-term benefit and happiness. So the First Noble Truth, simply put, is that clinging is suffering. It's because of clinging that physical pain becomes mental pain. It's because of clinging that aging, illness, and death cause mental distress. The paradox here is that in clinging to things, we don't trap them or get them under our control. Instead, we trap ourselves. When we realize our captivity, we naturally search for a way out. And this is where it's so important that the First Noble Truth not say that life is suffering. If life were suffering, where would we look for an end to suffering? We'd be left with nothing but death and annihilation. But when the actual truth is that clinging is suffering, we simply have to look for the clinging and eliminate its causes. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. Sadhu. 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 Thank you for joining me this morning.